You didn't raise that long back, did you?
No, we raised a Series A in about. It's not market sensitive information.
Yes.
Hello and welcome to this Onward event on smart AI regulation and economic growth. My name is Anastasia Bektimirova and I'm a senior researcher on the science and technology team here at Onward. So, AI regulation. This is a topic of critical, or as some would argue, existential importance. And countries in different parts of the world are coming up with the ways to regulate or not to regulate AI. And indeed, AI presents risks, such as algorithmic bias, misinformation, and also deliberate misuse of AI can have some consequences, which may pose existential threats. But also, AI presents massive opportunities for economic growth, and these opportunities for prosperity are subject to a regulatory environment that is smart and that supports innovation rather than stifles it, while also promoting ethical, responsible, and safe AI development and deployment. That is not an easy balance to strike. But our brilliant panel of experts is going to shed some light on the ways in which we can accomplish this, while also ensuring that the AI-powered opportunities can be spread across the entire country. So today we're joined by Jonathan Camrose, Minister for AI and Intellectual Property. We are also joined by James Clough, who is a Chief Technology Officer at Robin AI. We are also joined by Priya Guha, who is a UKRI board member and also a member of a partner at Miriam Ventures, but she's here in a personal capacity with us today. And we are also joined by Richard Mollet, who is the head of European Government Affairs at RELX and who is very kindly supporting today's event. Thank you.
Pleasure.
So now a few things about the technical side of today's session. We're going to start with a round of very brief opening remarks for each of our panelists, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from all of you in the audience. You can also engage with us on social media. Our Twitter or X handle is UK Onward, and you can use CPC23 as the conference hashtag. This session is also broadcast live on UK Onward YouTube, which you can tune in now or later. So to kick us off, I'd like to turn to you, Minister, first. So, of course, you're thinking a lot about how the government is approaching AI regulation. So could you perhaps give us a sense of what is the government's thinking of this balance between responsible AI use and deployment, which is also promoting innovation?
Sure. Is this working? Yes. Okay, that sounds better. I think the first thing to say that I'd like to make very clear is that I and I believe everybody in the government is very, very much an optimist on the subject of AI, in the belief that it can, as Anastasia says, produce unbelievable wealth, prosperity for all of us, can solve a huge range of problems. But, and there's a big but, we have to ensure that it is safe, that it is trustworthy. And a lot of that comes to the role of regulation. And regulating AI, in some sense, it ought to be quite straightforward. We've done this many times before, here's a new technology, let's figure out how to regulate it. But in some sense, it's a very difficult challenge to regulate AI. So let me talk super briefly about our thinking and approach to how this is going to work, and what may arise to challenge that. So I think our starting point is, don't regulate something because of the kind of technology it's made of. Regulate something because of the principles it violates or because of a law that it breaks. And that takes us to a place of using existing regulators as far as possible in order to deliver regulation, whether for AI or anything else. But recognize that those existing regulators have to be supported by a central risk function of some kind. That is making sure that risks on the horizon are spotted, making sure that the right regulator is involved in the right discussion and the right decision making, and making sure that the regulators have the correct skills. That's the first thing, and I think that kind of model gives us, I think, a blueprint for an agile approach to regulating AI as it goes. But, and this is the final point I'll make, and sorry I'm speaking for much too long, the key thing here, I think, is going to be international engagement and making sure that our regulation is interoperable with international regulation. And I'm sure questions about this will come up, but that's one of the sort of outcomes that I think, or a journey we will start on with the coming AI Safety Summit, just 1 month away now. Very exciting stuff, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And now, Jonathan, let me turn to you. Could you provide a business perspective? What is it that AI-focused businesses want to see in the regulatory framework that is going to help them thrive?
Yeah, I think there's two main things. The first is probably the most important one. The government just needs to very explicitly take a pro-innovation approach to building this regulation and consider the costs as well as the benefits of every new piece of regulation that's brought in. I think we've done a good job of doing this so far, and the white paper earlier this year signalled intent to have this way of thinking, which is something that's been very positively received, I think, across the industry. But it's not something that everybody does. The EU, I think, does a very bad job of this. The EU AI Act has failed to do this very effectively. And so that's what getting this wrong, I think, can look like. But beyond that, I think it's important to build a sort of political culture where big, successful technology companies, which by virtue of being successful will be large and will be profitable and will have significant market shares, that's seen as a good thing and not a bad thing, And we have to sort of accept the fact that none of the world's biggest technology companies are based in the UK, but that can change. But you do have to want to win. You do have to want to get to the point that success is going to look like. And so we have the right ingredients, we have talent, we have capital, but that ecosystem is very self-reinforcing. And so you do have to really start winning right at the start of the new wave of technology that's coming. And that means being very proactive about encouraging that innovation right now. So we're very well placed to do this, but we do need to follow through on the promise that was sort of given to us in the white paper. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing that we can maybe do a bit better at is, and this will benefit many AI-focused businesses, big and small, in the UK, is draw a bit of a better distinction between AI that's being sold to other businesses, so business to business, versus AI that's being sold in a business to consumer way. And regulators often only really consider consumers rather than other businesses as buyers of this technology, which is quite natural. Most people think about consumer-facing technology when they think about this regulation. But again, lots of the world's largest software companies and lots of startups, probably about half of them, are not selling to consumers at all. They're selling to other businesses. And when your customer is another business, then many of the risks that we want to regulate away don't really apply nearly as seriously, because businesses can hold their AI provider to account a lot better than a consumer can. So my company is in the legal space. Now, if ChatGPT misleads a person on a legal issue, then that's a serious issue that is ChatGPT's fault. But if it misleads a professional lawyer who's qualified and should know better, then I think it's reasonable to say that that's much more the professional lawyer's fault for being misled than would be the case if it was a consumer. So because businesses and professionals can hold each other to account a lot better than consumers can, means that regulation for consumers should be proportionately more powerful, but regulation for other businesses can be a lot more light touch, and we can benefit from the fast pace of innovation that results from having that lighter touch, more sort of trust-based approach without suffering harm to consumers, which is what this regulation is trying to protect. So I think there is sort of money on the table or innovation on the table to be had by drawing that distinction and giving businesses that are using AI to help make people more productive and generate economic growth. You can kind of unleash that productivity boost while still protecting consumers from new technology they don't understand. But you do have to draw that distinction. Again, I think the EU AI Act hasn't really done a very good job of this, but we can do a much better job of this and can win in that space if we take that focus.
Thank you, James. And now let me turn to you, Richard. In your role at RELX, you are overseeing the regulatory issues in the UK, but also in the EU. So how well is the UK placed to offer that pro-innovation regulatory framework?
Certainly. Well, thank you, Anastasia, and thanks for having RELX as a partner at the event and me on the panel. Just before I answer that question, I'm conscious there may be people in the room who aren't immediately familiar with RELX. We're not a household name. I would say we should be. We're a UK business success story, the 11th biggest company on the FTSE. We run Elsevier, the world's largest scientific publisher, LexisNexis, the legal publisher, a company called Risk Solutions, which works in financial industry using machine learning to tackle things like money laundering, and an exhibitions business. So in all of those, we're taking data, often our own proprietary data or others, putting it with analytic systems, machine learning systems, extractive AI, and now these days generative AI to help our customers make decisions. So that's what we do. So we have two dogs in the fight, or both of the dogs that are in the fight, because we're a content owner. We care deeply about copyright. We're also a developer of AI, and we care deeply about innovation. And Jonathan, as we were saying earlier about your department looking after both those things, well, so do we. And we don't see a dichotomy at all between rights holders and technology. They of course, go together. So to the regulatory question, I'd agree with Jonathan that, with Jonathan that the UK's got the approach right. Taking a domain specialist sector approach to regulating AI seems better than a horizontal regulation. And I think the way the UK is going about that is the right way. But in terms of the broader regulatory question, it shouldn't just be down to what governments or parliaments do. It comes down importantly to what companies do. We've got to self-regulate. RELX, like a number of other companies, published our AI principles last year, where we commit to always being cognizant of the impact on society, of bias, of the need for transparency, of accountability, explainability, and the impact on data privacy and governance. And that's what we commit to do, irrespective of what the law says. But we also believe firmly that responsible AI means knowing what you're putting into your system and telling people. We have generative AI products in the law and in healthcare and in scientific research. And if we don't know what's in those systems, then the impact of false outputs are obviously incredibly damaging. So that's why we support what the Publishers Association in the UK is doing, and we're members of that, by the way, as well as of Tech UK, to require the providers of generative AI to make available a summary of the protected works they've used in the training and testing of their system. And this echoes what the European Parliament is asking for in the context of the AI Act as well. Because unless you're responsible, then in some fields the output is going to be highly damaging. So we think that's the right thing to do in terms of responsible AI. It's also the right thing to do, by the way, in terms of copyright, because copyright is about consent and credit and compensation, and you can't get that if you don't know whether or not your stuff has been used. So we share totally in Jonathan what you said, Minister Jonathan, in terms of the government's optimism about AI. It's delivering benefits already. It will continue to do so, but regulation has to contain the very possible risks that emerge. And part of that is companies being honest, telling people what they're putting in the system so that we can have a safe output.
Thank you, Richard. Now, on to you, Priya. So, from your viewpoint, what are these ways in which the UK can build that future-proof regulatory framework that would promote innovation? What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, a lot of things have been mentioned here, and just to draw some of that out, I think we've talked about having sort of guardrails and principles of operation. We've talked about sort of what are the values that we want to build into the regulatory angle that we're looking at AI through. We've also talked about differentiation, and I think for me, differentiation is really, really key. The reality is we do need to undergo a psychological shift about how we think about regulation for an area like AI, because unlike in previous technological changes where we can actually follow step-by-step a process through, the reality is with artificial intelligence, you will not necessarily be able to understand the inner workings of the process, but what you will be able to think about are the inputs and the outputs. So there is a slight sort of mental shift we need to undertake there that I think is quite important. So it is a different era. This is a moment of change, I think, for how we're all thinking. But just coming back to the sort of bifurcations of how we want to think about the regulation, you know, James talked about there's a difference between B2B and B2C. I would entirely agree with that. We also had a comment just there from Richard about thinking about domain-specific regulation. Again, I think that is really fundamental, because the problem with the phrase artificial intelligence is that it encompasses so many different applications of technology. You know, Richard was rightly talking about, you know, generative large language models and some of the constraints and thinking that we need to have in the back of our heads when we're thinking about application of regulation to generative large language models. But that's different to other sectors. You know, you've talked about it in the context of legal tech, but an area I work extensively in is using AI in health. One of the companies I work with has an amazing technology that can detect 13% more breast cancer than the normal processes that we operate normally. And that's actually a heavily regulated sector where these technologies have been proven already. So let's make sure that we're thinking through all of those different sectoral use cases and not creating this sort of blanket nervousness and a reactive regulatory space that can constrain that innovation, which again, I think that theme running through what everybody said about the need not to constrain innovation. There are two other points that I think I would draw out that haven't been mentioned so much yet. I think one is, you know, there is a real risk here that we are having a conversation that can negatively influence the direction of public opinion. Rightly, as we come together in a month's time for the AI summit, our focus is actually inevitably going to be on some of the really dramatic potential international consequences of a misuse of AI. But what we want to make sure is that that conversation isn't out of step with public opinion and somehow suggesting that all of the use cases of AI are actually as risky and negative as potentially they can be in the security space. And that links across, I think, to one of the real opportunities. You know, we've talked about some of the opportunities there already in areas like health, for example. But actually, there is a real opportunity in just general business adoption of AI. And I was really concerned with a recent study that the British Chambers of Commerce did that said about 48% of businesses, and this is, you know, very frequently small businesses who they're surveying, aren't even considering adopting AI. And that's worrying because actually AI can really transform business. And if we want, as I think everybody on this panel does, the UK to be the leading voice in how artificial intelligence develops and actually have British business being the voice of the future, we need to make sure that we're creating an environment where all our businesses can take advantage of it, not only the businesses that are at the forefront of creating it.
Thank you, Priya. And especially on your point that a sector-based approach is very important, it's also very much in line with our panel today because we represent so many different sectors. So now let's turn to the audience questions. Can we take a few questions? So please, can we have gentlemen at the front, and then we have two gentlemen at the back. We have running mics, so please wait until one of our colleagues reaches you. Thank you.
Hello, Stuart Barr. I'm a CEO of an early-stage AI tech startup, very concerned about regulation. Two aspects of it. I've just been in the session about the online harms bill. And one of my big concerns about how government does tech regulation is that there's a lot of very powerful lobbying from very large platforms, and it's very easy for regulation to be put in place in a way that builds barriers around their own business and doesn't allow innovation to come through. And so I would urge the government to really think about how you can allow innovative startups to have a lower level of regulation to enable that innovation to take place. And then the second point, also to do with the online harms bill, is the amount of time it's taken to get that legislation through has been ridiculous. And the problem is technology moves on so quickly that the danger is that you regulate for what was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So again, what I'd like to see in this drive to smart regulation is how the whole process of government can be speeded up.
Thank you. Let's take a few more questions. There were two gentlemen at the back. Yes, please.
Hello there, Michael Birtwistle from the Ada Lovelace Institute. I'm really interested on the comments from the panel around how people buy and sell businesses, buy and sell AI to each other. One of the things we've seen over the last year is the advent of foundation models, very powerful models that often sit at the top of very long value chains. And I'm wondering what the panel, whether the panel feels that we have the right tools for managing liability across those supply chains and who absorbs the sort of the risks of the models being used. And what that means for sort of how competitive our markets are and who gets to use these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was one more question at the back. Thank you.
Hey, I work for Conjecture, the largest alignment lab in the UK. This is to Viscount Camrose. I was just wondering, in Minister Michelle Donlin's speech at CogX Festival the other week, she spoke about responsible scaling, which basically means the largest companies making the frontier models iterate ever closer to more powerful models, and then when a danger emerges, that's when they act. What if that response time is too late and we end up creating an unmitigated disaster because we weren't careful enough? Thank you.
Thank you. The Minister, do you want to jump at the last question first, as it was directed to you, and then we'll...
Sure. Actually, if I can comment on some of the stuff and then sort of build to that. I mean, I think there is very broadly a problem. Government is, the way legislation is created in this country is slower than the way technology is created, and always will be. I think the challenge, particularly with AI, is to regulate where you can with existing regulators, recognize there will be moments when we need to legislate, but be very, very targeted about what those are and going quickly. You know, I think the online safety bill is, I very much take the point, it took ages, but that was maybe because it had to go back over an awful lot of material for decades or more, and solve a problem or solve something that had been growing out by itself for a very long time in a very uncontrolled way. Designing that thing was incredibly hard. I think we have the capability now to be very focused about targeting regulation towards specific outcomes and targeting legislation towards specific outcomes. So again, I hope that that puts us in a good position. This business about kind of addressing the liability across the supply chain, it is true, and I think it also, this goes to your point as well. I think the strength of our approach to legislation is to say, because we're letting existing regulators deal with it, and because we're going after principles, not specific pieces of technology, that means that if it's already illegal, it's illegal to do it with AI. And I think that helps a great deal kind of maintain the speed and flexibility. As to, you know, does that give us sufficient flexibility to allow the very largest platforms to scale and then just in time act on that? We have to keep an eye on that. I mean, there is no sort of totally reassuring answer that I can give you other than that, you know, let's all really be aware of that risk and kind of keep a close eye on it. But it's a fast-moving field.
Thank you. And does anyone else on the panel want to add a few thoughts on the first two questions? So about startups and the lower level of regulation for them, and also foundation models and managing liability.
Yeah, I think on the liability question, I think from my point of view, it's relatively simple. I think the right approach is to essentially say that businesses, when they're interacting with each other, they can just define for themselves who has liability for what. So Microsoft and OpenAI, for example, basically say if you get sued because our language model in your product does something it shouldn't, then we'll help you out. And that's because they want people to have confidence that they're not taking all the risk. And so that's two businesses working together to define the liability clearly. I think you can just do that kind of all the way through the chain of businesses working with each other, right up until you get to the end where you now have a business interacting with a consumer. And the approach we normally take with that, I think is right here again, is you say, well, the consumer isn't a business with experts and lawyers and all the rest of it. They are a bit more vulnerable. They have to be looked after by regulation provided by government. And so it's that last step in the chain where regulation is important. But all the other steps in the chain where all of these productivity increases come from, I think, perhaps some exceptions, but generally as a general rule, just let businesses sort that out for themselves, hold each other to account, and have them decide who has liability for what, which is what we do in other sectors. And I think it should work here as well.
Yeah.
Anastasia, if I may just comment on the comment around larger companies and smaller players. I think for me it's not so much having separate regulation per se for large and small, but the principle of innovation has to be that it doesn't cement market incumbency and stifle innovation. One of the things that I think the UK has historically done very well, and I hope will continue to do, is create sort of sandbox environments where you can have a more experimental opportunity for newer players to come in and test and iterate in a way that allows them a seat at the table. And, you know, the fundamental point you're making, which, you know, I would 100% agree with, is that this can't just be a large versus small debate. This has to be a conversation where everyone gets a say in the future of the regulations that will define the future of the ecosystem for everyone.
Thank you. Richard, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, we are one of those companies that takes LLMs developed by others and then in very close collaboration apply them to our content, whether that be the Lexis legal database or the Scopus research database, and it is indeed about the sort of the contractual arrangements one has with the LLM rather than a fire and forget, taking on trust what you're given. No, the whole iteration of the development of that product happens in close cooperation. And on the small business point, there are rules of the road, right? And we often hear in the context of this and other debates that, well, copyright gets in the way of innovation. I'm a small business, not that you were saying this, but a small business. Can we step aside from these rights? And the answer has to come back no. There are some things that are the law, whether one is Google or indeed a very small startup. So let's obey the law as written, and then the innovation can develop.
Thank you. Let's take a few more questions. Let's do gentleman at the back over there, a lady here at the back in the middle, to the right, and a gentleman in the middle.
Okay, thank you. Tom Keel from UK Music. 12 months ago, there was a lot of concern about a proposed copyright exception. The government listened, and there was a pause on that. We're now undergoing a process with government regarding a potential code of conduct around AI and copyright-related materials. There was a very ambitious timetable for that, and to try and agree that by the summer. These are very complex issues, and that did not ultimately succeed in terms of that time frame. But we're still undergoing those processes. I just wonder. We've yet to really see the barriers, and kind of building on Richard's further point, from a rights holder perspective, a code of conduct could be a quite blunt instrument at the end of the day, and actually no substitute for the legal framework that we have. So, in particular to the Minister, but for other panellists as well, I would appreciate thoughts as to a simple restatement of the importance of consent and the existing legal framework, whether that will act essentially as what essentially we can achieve there, and whether that's an approach that can be taken.
Thank you. There was a question here. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Joanna. I'm from Asia House. We're a think tank advisory service based in London. My question is to the Minister. You mentioned about international engagement efforts earlier in your remarks. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what efforts the UK government has made on that aspect. Maybe elaborate a bit on the goals of the Global AI Summit in November. And also if there are any key markets that you're looking at in terms of interoperability of standards. Thank you.
And the next question? Yeah.
Hi, Sam Olsen from Adaga, British AI company. I run their research. And I note as we grow and open offices around the world that we're not the only country who's looking at AI regulation. Many other countries are as well. And to go back to the point earlier made about big companies, not British companies, who are really pushing for their own type of regulation, what do you think that we can do as a government, as a country, to make sure that it is British AI regulation that dominates the world rather than that of other countries, which might not necessarily be in our best interests?
An excellent question. Thank you. So we have three questions, one about copyright and AI, another one is about AI Summit and key priority markets, and then AI regulation and international perspective. How do we ensure the UK is leading when it comes to standards? Who wants to go first? The Minister, please.
I'm happy to go. Right. Let's talk copyright. My going in position on this is, if you create a piece of content, you deserve to be rewarded in a fair way for doing so. And it doesn't matter what use is made of that content, you deserve, as the creator of that content, deserve to be rewarded. And we have to come up with a system that it doesn't stifle innovation, but nor does it stifle people's willingness to create content, whether scientific or artistic or any other kind of content. And I think, the next thing we're going to see on that is a statement of principles. You're right. I mean, maybe the idea of having a code of conduct neatly done by the summer was, in retrospect, a little bit ambitious, but we take this very seriously. It's difficult, but we're going to get there. Just in terms of international engagement, very quickly, there's, in addition to the AI Summit, which focuses on frontier risks, those further out there and perhaps more existential risks, there's a range of international symmetry and activity and standards. There's the OECD, from which we derive our own AI principles for our regulation group called the GPAI, set up as part of the G7. There's the Hiroshima Accord, to your question, from Asia House. So there's a range of these things, and indeed in private and university sector as well, there's a huge range of these things. As to how we are able to impose our view of the regulatory world on other nations, I don't know. I would love to, I don't know. And I think the real answer is there's got to be minimal international standards for AI safety, and then probably beneath that, national standards, and different countries will pursue their own regulation as they see fit. How that machine works, I don't know yet.
Thank you, Minister. Richard?
Yeah, just on that international standards point, we, as a company that earns half our revenue in the US, a lot in Europe, a hefty chunk in China and in India, and we're developing our products there. What's important to us is not necessarily that it's one country's regulation that is then mapped across the world, but that there are international standards. And it's why when the EU first draft of the Act came up and they defined AI in a very peculiar way, we, and I think most other companies, said, could you please look at the OECD definition, which at least has a tighter understanding of what we're talking about, and put that into EU legislation, which broadly they've done. And happily, I think the UK is doing the same, and it forms the basis of international conversations on this. So at least the starting point is we're talking about the same thing, at least. And I think that's more important, that every country has the same sort of framework, rather than, let's go out into the world because British regulation is the thing to follow. Because I frankly, I don't think that would necessarily happen.
Thank you, Richard. James?
Yeah, I think on the international standards point, it's worth separating out two quite different discussions. The first is on the sort of very serious existential risk in the near future thing the AI Summit is focused on, thing the AI Task Force is focused on. And that's a very sort of narrow focused but important question. That's where international standards are important, because if there's an existential risk in China, that's still very dangerous to us, right? And so it matters that you have that sort of global agreement on mitigating those very serious but very precise risks. I think that's just sort of one question. Then there's a separate question about things like copyright and using data fairly and protecting consumers and telling them that the chatbot they're interacting with is a chatbot, not a person. I think that's much broader. It's much harder to reach international agreement there. We've seen with the EU AI Act what happens when you try and get 25 different countries to agree on what those rules should look like. You end up it taking ages and the output being quite confused at the end. So I don't think there's as much of a need to be so international with that category of regulation, which is what affects most businesses, most consumers. That's what we're talking about most of the time. But on the very precise, narrow question of the existential risk, AI summit type issues, that is where international standardization is very important, and there's an urgency to do that effectively and quickly, but we'll only be able to do that internationalization effectively for that narrow question if we keep it narrow. If that question broadens out to be about absolutely everything, changes to the nature of work and job losses and ethics and data, then nothing will happen. So better to keep that important stuff very focused and narrow rather than make it about everything.
Thank you, James. Priya, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I suppose just to build off what James just said there, which I entirely agree with, I think, the opportunity to use sort of James's two categories on the former category, the sort of broad category, lies really in that sort of very high level values-based alignment that I think we can share with Western liberal democracies, and that can create some sort of basic core principles of opportunity that then enable companies that are building their technologies here in the UK to have an ability to easily move between global markets. Because to come back to that conversation about sort of large versus small, one of the challenges of the small is that you don't have the large regulatory compliance departments that can make those international transfers easier if you're a larger player. So I think the more that we can, whilst recognizing the difference between the two strands of regulation, allow our companies the best market advantage by aligning where it makes sense globally, I think we're only doing our economy, our UK tech businesses, a great service.
Thank you, Priya. We have time for some more questions. Do you have more questions? Okay. A gentleman here on the left at the front, another gentleman here at the front, and another gentleman at the front. Thank you.
Hi, Louis Quaffer-Gunn from the Publishers Association. One of the principles that the white paper talks about is transparency. I don't quite understand what the argument for not being transparent is, but everything that we want in terms of safety, copyright compliance, all these things, you have to start with transparency. I wondered if the panel agree that that these companies should be more transparent, and if so, practically how?
Thank you. There were 2 questions. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Cian Duggan from Intellectual Digital AI. Just a question on AI and digital ID, in particular potentially blockchain-based digital ID. Any kind of thoughts on that? Any regulation on that in the making as a solution, particularly for things like copyright, etc.?
A great question. Thank you. And there was one more question here. Thank you.
I'm Lalit Suryavanshi. I'm a CTO and co-founder of iTeco Health based in Leeds. We have a digital health product using AI. And my question to the panel is, and you mentioned, Priyaji, you mentioned about you also work advisor for a medtech company. Regulation is important, I understand, in healthcare. But where we are in NHS in terms of data, in terms of digital capabilities, we are far away from actually getting the benefits of AI in healthcare. And there is and also Priyaji, you mentioned about the negativity surrounding AI. So yes, it's good to talk about AI and all these things, but what we need to do to bring that positive message so that people understand that AI, at least in healthcare, is important and it will help the country and overall economy.
Thank you. A great question. So we have 3 questions. The first one is about transparency and how can we practically achieve it. The second one is about AI and digital ID. And then we have a question about negative discourse around AI and also AI in health. Minister, do you want to start?
Sure. All right. Transparency, yeah, I'm in favour of it. I just think it's so important. And it's important from the perspective of protecting copyright, protecting the rights of creators and owners of content. It's also important for the general sense of fairness in the use. If you are denied a mortgage or insurance or something for the wrong reasons, that information should be made available. So as far as the implementation of transparency, that's more difficult, but we have to do that in order to explain AI's decisions. Digital ID, I mean, I remember in the 2000s we were all up in arms about ID cards and we can't have them. But actually, I mean, I must confess, I've really come a long journey on this, and I think digital ID cards would solve an awful lot of our problems online. Just if everybody online was who they said they were, that would, I believe, create a lot of positive effects. So I think, and with blockchain, the tech is there, so certainly one to take further. Lastly, digital health. I can't think of many better things to do with AI than improve healthcare. I really can't. I think it's we've got the data, we've got the problem space that can really help with that. All of us collectively have to, and I want to get this message out because I have to leave in a moment, and I want to be very clear. I think we all have to speak about AI in a more positive way if we can bring ourselves to, particularly about these benefits in health and others, because once we're able to shed our well-founded concerns about AI, then we're going to see huge benefits, and I suspect one of the places we'll see these huge benefits first is in healthcare.
Thank you, Minister. Richard?
Yeah, just to echo that, and this is a problem that faces companies big and small, and it's of course a result of GDPR rules and UK GDPR. We have a healthcare business that uses AI, again, like Priya, around oncology, and it's difficult to do that in Europe because of the permissions around the data, which have been put there for good reasons, but I think they could be old-fashioned reasons, because as the Minister said, as the opportunities of AI are now allowing us to do things with that data, can we go back and look at the rules and say, are you really sure you don't want somebody to be able to look at this X-ray? completely anonymized, completely untraceable back to you, so that we can help more people with whatever disease. So we need not just new AI regulation, but a revisit of some of the rules around use of data.
Thank you, Richard. James, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think on transparency first. So I think it's obviously going to be one of those things where everybody is in favour of it in principle and the details matter. But what I think then the regulation has to do is just be really clear as to what rights to what kind of transparency you give people. So for example, if you say a chatbot always has to tell the user that it is AI and not a person, that's some very useful transparency. It's very clear what you're asking a provider to do. They can just implement that in their product, and that's easy. But if you say something like, if you enshrine some positive right and say, that you have the right to have any decisions explained to you if the decision's made by AI, that's still transparency, but it's now very unclear what that means. What constitutes a good enough explanation? Does that explanation have to be actually linked to the decision-making process, and in what way? So just writing that down as a rule in a piece of regulation would, I think, be quite unhelpful, because no one would know what it actually means, and you just have to wait until you did it and then got sued by someone, and then a judge would decide what constituted an adequate explanation. And that's obviously a lot of time and a lot of risk that people don't want to go through. So that is the risk, I think, of just sort of enshrining rights to certain kinds of transparency in regulation, is that if it's not clear what you're actually asking for, then you can really hold back innovation. I think the same is true really on the healthcare point, in a way that there's lots of very sensible, well-meaning regulation that protects patients, but there are costs to that as well. Every year that you delay some new technology that can diagnose illnesses better from scans, then maybe like thousands of people die every time you delay that. And that cost you don't really see. That's very hidden, but we should be really aware of that cost. And when building in these new regulations, actually do the cost-benefit analysis and say, if we increase data protection in this way, okay, patients are protected, in this way they weren't before, that's good, but maybe 10,000 people more die of cancer who could have not died before. Is that worth it? And be really honest about the fact that you are actually doing that trade-up when you make these rules. I think sometimes people kind of just forget about the costs that are a bit more invisible.
Thank you, James. Priya, any thoughts on any of these questions?
I was just going to pull out one comment. I think I picked on some of the conversation that we'd had around health tech and public awareness earlier, so I won't repeat that, but just actually a slightly different angle to the transparency question for me is around something that I think our colleagues from the Ada Lovelace Institute would share, which is how we think about transparency in terms of diversity of data sets that are used for training data. I think that is one of the fundamental things that needs to be mandated, because otherwise we risk reinforcing a world that is already undiverse in the beginning, and some pretty disastrous consequences of that. So I know that's probably not where you were going with the question on transparency, but it's just an opportunity, I think, to bring out the importance of that whilst we're having a debate on artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Priya. The minister had to leave us a bit earlier, but we have time for one more question. Who has the last question to conclude? Well, yes, please, gentleman in the back.
Alex Walker. A question around the national security aspect of AI. Obviously, the regulatory conversation we've been having is about how we can create an environment where it thrives here in the UK. But obviously, there are state actors and non-state actors that may not follow the rules in the future, and how we protect our key industries, healthcare, genomics being one of them, against those threats around the world.
Thank you. A fantastic question. Richard, would you like?
Well, I wish the minister was here, because he could answer that. I can't. I hope the AI summit is going to do exactly that, address that problem, bad actors and international collaboration on it. As a company, we just obviously have to make sure our systems are well secure, and as we always have to do anyway. Nobody wants to be subject to a cyber attack. So, let's hope Bletchley Park provides the answer.
I think if I may, I think this is where actually these frontier technologies can provide some of the solution, as well as potentially be the risk. And you're absolutely right, Richard. The AI summit should hopefully be an opportunity to put some of those issues on the table. We are thinking about this from a national security perspective, but equally, we have a shared journey with partners who align with our thinking around national security. So it is a really good discussion to be having, but also one where it comes back to my concern that I expressed earlier about sort of general awareness of technology, because actually we need to be talking to the public, businesses large and small, about where these threats might come in. I mean, to have Elon Musk, as he did the other day, say that, charging subscribers for X, for Twitter, is basically the only way he can think of avoiding a huge spam bots operating on the platform, is a pretty disastrous state of affairs. So really important, good opportunity to talk about it in a month's time, but we're not alone in thinking about it, which is a good place to start from.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that the national security questions are just really hard. And so the two things we can at least do is, one, like I've been saying before, make sure that we have a sufficiently pro-innovation approach to regulation here that means that we are at and are aware of the forefront of the technologies that other people also have. There's no point us holding ourselves back and then being much more at risk of bad actors who have technologies that we then don't have. That's the first thing. And the second thing is just make sure that we have a kind of agile and expert-led approach to building that regulation. So I think what we've done with the AI task force is very good in that regard, just appointing experts and giving them quite a lot of free rein and money to just quickly do things, rather than the kind of traditional approach to building regulation, which is very slow and sometimes a bit too consensus-driven. That means that you might eventually get to a better answer, but if it takes too long, then that's a lot worse than having something good in the meantime. So being sort of quick, expert-driven, agile, and making sure that we are at the forefront of what's going on, I think is at least the way you can position yourself to react sensibly to those threats when they do occur. It's probably too hard to sort of know in advance everything that might happen.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Priya. We have time for one last quick question. Do we have a question from the audience to conclude? Well, in this case, I have a question. So, as I mentioned before, our panel is very diverse, and we have representatives from different sectors. And AI has opportunities to reinforce progress in so many different sectors. And I just wonder, what do you think are the ways in which the government can assist to foster that cross-technology, innovative environment? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I'd have to come back to the data point. I think that is one of the big barriers, because the innovation, as you say, is going on anyway, and the development of the models is happening at pace. The price of computing power is falling all the time. The speed with which models can be developed is coming down all the time. So one of the few barriers I can see that would stand in the way of further progression is the problem of access to data. I'm sure there are others, but that's the first that occurs to me.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one thing we haven't actually discussed too much so far is while I think that the approach of having industry-specific regulators still kind of be in charge of AI in their industries does generally make sense, there is a risk with that approach that where industries are going to get disrupted a lot by AI, that the regulator, which is sort of populated by people who are in the way the industry works today, just engages in regulatory capture to stop that kind of innovation happening. So you can imagine, again, for example, if in the legal sector, legal regulators and law firms might work closely together to build regulation for AI in the legal sector, they might do that in a way that slows rather than speeds up innovation if they perceive it as being too disruptive to their traditional way of doing business. So that's not to say you shouldn't involve the industry regulator when building AI regulation for that industry, but it's perhaps to say that you shouldn't just let them do whatever they like, because they might, in some circumstances, be too hostile to disruptive technology that changes their the way they're doing business currently. And that disruptive technology is going to happen anyway. We might as well just have it happen on our terms and develop it.
Thank you, James. Priya?
I mean, I would say that from where I sit, one of the biggest challenges, and we touched on it earlier, is actually that our parliamentary system does not align with an innovative approach to regulation. And so fundamentally, we're going to have to work out how we make sure we maintain all the best lessons of insight and scrutiny that our parliamentary process gives us, but enabling us to create a very fast regulatory process that will be, to use phrases that we've used a few times but are important, agile, expert-led, and reactive to the newest technologies that are coming through. And I'm not quite sure that the two things are currently in alignment.
Thank you. This is a great point to conclude. So this brings our panel to an end. Thank you to every single panelist that we have welcomed today. Also, thank you to the minister who had to leave earlier. Thank you to our audience and for the excellent questions. And also, thank you again to you, Richard, from RELX for sponsoring today's event. We have many more events coming up. The next one is about how to unlock the potential of cities through private investments and public-private partnerships. So you're very welcome to attend that one as well. Thank you so much for coming.